375 million registered voters, 28 member states, one parliament. Europeans go to the polls this week in elections that could have a major impact on the European Union. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Europeans vote this week to elect 751 members to the European Parliament. The elections stretch all across the 28 states that make up the European Union, and with a big spike in anti-EU sentiment and anger over years of economic problems, polls suggest there could be a significant change in the makeup of the new Parliament. Well, joining us now from Brussels is CCTV's correspondent, Jack Barton. And Jack, let's look at the nuts and bolts of the European Parliament firstly. What exactly does the Parliament do?
Well, the Parliament is extremely powerful. About 50% of all of the laws in the EU's 28 member states have been rubber-stamped, in many cases created by the European Parliament. So that's an equal amount of legislation to the actual legislation passed by national parliaments. Usually it's the Commission that formulates most of that legislation, but over the past few years, as the Parliament has become increasingly more powerful, it's tried to shape more of that itself. In fact, it now even wants the right to determine who the next European Commissioner will be. But in the face of that, we've also seen growing apathy. Few people in the EU can even name an MEP. In the UK, that's 1 in 9 people. And certainly we've seen voter turnout falling. Back in 2009, it was only around 43%. And since then, we've had the crisis in full swing. It's feared those numbers could be even lower this month. And many of those who turn out will be casting a protest vote.
Right, Jack, you mentioned that one of the powers that the MEPs would like, that is the power to elect the European Commission president. But what are the powers they have right now?
Well, the powers that they really have right now are in shaping the laws that come down. The way it works is the European Commission comes up with most of the legislation. It's then passed through the 28 EU leaders who meet at the Council, and then it's passed down to the European Parliament where they debate it, and then they decide whether to pass that legislation or whether to throw it out. But what we've really seen over the past few years is the Parliament pushing forward, and now we're seeing a lot of that actual legislation that runs through the Commission is actually beginning in the European Parliament. So there is a lot of controversy here in Brussels surrounding that. One, that so much legislation is coming from the Parliament. Secondly, that, as you mentioned, they want to choose the Commissioner now, which would essentially give the Parliament say over how legislation is created from both the Parliament and from the European Commission. So it does have an enormous impact. It is, as I mentioned before, creating about 50% of the legislation in the 28 EU member states at the moment. And that is why, to a large degree, there is such a backlash as well, because much of that legislation feeds into the austerity program, slashing of wages, the slashing of pension programs. And that is what is really feeding into that resentment that is leading to growing Euroscepticism here at the moment.
Right. This election, 2014, what are the major issues dominating the poll?
Well, the major issues are normally issues like climate change, European expansion, but this year it is really about the future of the EU itself, and that's because we are expecting that major rise in Eurosceptic parties. We've seen them making strong gains at national polls. Parties like the United Kingdom Independence Party in Britain, the National Front in France, and Geert Wilders' Party of Freedom in the Netherlands. And at the moment, Geert Wilders' poll show is the most popular politician in the Netherlands. They are expected to reflect those gains in the European Parliament, so they are really driving the issue forward. One of the key issues is really immigration. For the northern, the richer countries, immigration has become a key issue in national and European level politics. For the South, it's about austerity. It's about winding back some of those crushing austerity programs, which they believe is leading to stubbornly high unemployment, low wages. So that has really been the key driving force from the Eurosceptic side. What there hasn't been is a real answer from the pro-Europe side, and policy analysts here in Brussels say if the Eurosceptic side make the gains they're expected to do, then the pro-EU side are really going to have to come up with a more comprehensive, more articulate argument for their critics.
Right, you mentioned some of those extremist parties, fringe parties. Let's look at one of them. You've just been in Britain, actually, and There's a party in Britain known as the United Kingdom Independence Party, or UKIP, known by its acronym, that's expected to do well in these elections. The party has an anti-immigrant platform. Some may say that it's a racist party. What's the appeal to the electorate?
Well, the appeal for the electorate, not just in Britain, but also in many EU countries, is that anti-immigration sentiment is rising. That's just a reality of politics in Northern Europe at the moment. Nigel Farage, the head of UKIP, is playing right into that. Now, ironically, or what he would say, he's not a racist, and he's actually refusing to form an alliance with parties like the National Front, Marine Le Pen's party in France, which has now become the third major political force in that country. She's teamed up with Geert Wilders in the Netherlands to form an alliance, along with four other parties around Europe. They're trying to form a bloc in the parliament. Nigel Farage and UKIP are saying they're too racist, but he's really the wild card, because if they get in, he gets in, their numbers really increase. He could decide to join forces, and if they get 7 parties in that bloc, they officially form a political bloc. So it means they don't just slow down legislation or throw a spanner into the works. It means they can actually shape policy in the parliament. And so Nigel Farage and UKIP, this really is the wild card party. No one knows whether they will stick to their word, not form part of that alliance, or whether once they're in there and once they have widened the seats, they already have about 13 in the parliament, if they get big gains, whether they'll go ahead, form that bloc and really start driving through a more right-wing, a more anti-immigrant policy in the parliament.
Right, Jack, you mentioned earlier the great deal of apathy over this election. And how is that going to affect turnout? I mean, we know turnout has been dropping steadily as these elections have taken place since 1979. In fact, it dropped down to 43% in the last election. Is there anything to indicate that this trend will continue with this election as well?
That is the fear, that it is going to keep falling. The other fear, particularly amongst the pro-EU parties, is because they really haven't been doing that much campaigning compared to the anti-EU parties, that it is the anti-EU voters who are going to come out and cast their votes. So even if we took a poll right across Europe and the anti-EU count were relatively small, their turnout in the elections could actually be much higher. And so that is the big concern. One, apathy. The second is that issues like the stubbornly high unemployment, the fall in wages, the fact that these austerity programs are still not just in place, but in many cases getting tougher, that bank credit is shrinking up, which means businesses aren't getting that credit. All of these things is leading to growing public anger. These parties, the anti-EU parties, are really out there campaigning much harder than their rivals. They are expected to get the people out there. At least a quarter of the votes, perhaps up to 30% of the votes, will be those anti-EU protest votes. And so that is really going to set the tone, it is expected, at the next parliament.
Okay, thanks, Jack. Jack Barton there from Brussels.